Chapter 19 of Ester Ried. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ester Ried by Pansy. Chapter 19. Sundries. Meanwhile the days moved on. The time fixed for Ester's return home had long passed, and yet she tarried in New York. Abbie clung to her, wanted her for various reasons; and the unselfish, pitying mother, far away, full of tender sympathy for the stricken bride, smothered a sigh of weariness, buried in her heart the thought of her own need of her eldest daughter's presence and help, and wrote a long, loving letter, jointly to the daughter and niece, wherein she gave her full consent to Ester's remaining away, so long as she could be a comfort to her cousin. Two items worthy of record occurred during these days. The first time the family gathered at the dinner table, after the one who had been so nearly a son of the house had been gathered to his rest in that wonderful and treasured city of Greenwood, Ralph, having been helped by John, as usual, to his glass of wine, refused it with a short, sharp, almost angry "No, take it away, and never offer me that accursed stuff again. We should have had him with us to day but for that. I'll never touch another drop of it as long as I live." Which startling words Mr. and Mrs. Ried listened to without comment, other than a half frightened look bestowed on Abbie, to see how she would bear this mention of her dead; and she bore it this way: turning her eyes, glistening with tears, full on her brother's face, she said, with a little quiver of tender gladness in her voice: "Oh, Ralph, I knew it had a silver lining, but I did not think God would let me see it so soon." Then Mr. and Mrs. Ried concluded that both their children were queer, and that they did not understand them. The other item was productive of a dissertation on propriety from Mrs. Ried. Ralph and his father were in the back parlor, the former standing with one arm resting on the mantel while he talked with his father, who was half buried in a great easy chair, that easy chair in his own elegant parlor, and his handsome son standing before him in that graceful attitude, were Mr. Ried's synonyms for perfect satisfaction; and his face took on a little frown of disappointment as the door opened somewhat noisily, and Mrs. Ried came in wearing a look expressive of thoroughly defined vexation. Ralph paused in the midst of his sentence, and wheeled forward a second easy chair for his mother, then returned to his former position, and waited patiently for the gathered frown to break into words, which event instantly occurred. "I really do not think, Mr. Ried, that this nonsense ought to be allowed. Besides being a very strange, unfeeling thing to do, it is in my opinion positively indecent; and I do think, Mr. Ried, that you ought to exercise your authority for once." "If you would kindly inform me what you are supposed to be talking about, and where my authority is specially needed at this time, I might be induced to consider the matter." This from the depths of the easy chair, in its owner's most provokingly indifferent tone, which fortunately Mrs. Ried was too much preoccupied to take special note of, and continued her storm of words. "Here it is not actually quite a week since he was buried, and Abbie must needs make herself and her family appear perfectly ridiculous by making her advent in public." Mr. Ried came to an upright posture, and even Ralph asked a startled question: "Where is she going?" "Why, where do you suppose, but to that absurd little prayer meeting, where she always would insist upon going every Thursday evening. I used to think it was for the pleasure of a walk home with Mr. Foster; but why she should go to night is incomprehensible to me." "Nonsense," said Mr. Ried, settling back into the cushions. "A large public that will be. I thought at the very least she was going to the opera. If the child finds any comfort in such an atmosphere, where's the harm? Let her go." "Where's the harm! Now, Mr. Ried, that is just as much as you care for appearances, sometimes, and at other times you can be quite as particular as I am; though I certainly believe there is nothing that Abbie might take a fancy to do that you would not uphold her in." Mr. Ried's reply was uttered in a tone that impressed one with the belief that he was uttering a deliberate conviction. "You are quite right as regards that, I suspect. At least I find myself quite unable to conceive of anything connected with her that could by any twisting be made other than just the thing." Mrs. Ried's exasperated answer was cut short by the entrance of Abbie, attired as for a walk or ride, the extreme pallor of her face and the largeness of her soft eyes enhanced by the deep mourning robes which fell around her like the night. "Now, Abbie," said Mrs. Ried, turning promptly to her, "I did hope you had given up this strangest of all your strange whims. What will people think?" "People are quite accustomed to see me there, dear mother, at least all the people who will see me to night; and if I ever needed help, I do just now." "I should think it would be much more appropriate to stay at home and find help in the society of your own family. That is the way other people do who are in affliction." Mrs. Ried had the benefit of a full, steady look from Abbie's great solemn eyes now, as she said: "Mother, I want God's help. No other will do me any good." "Well," answered Mrs. Ried, after just a moment of rather awe struck silence, "can't you find that help anywhere but in that plain, common little meeting house? I thought people with your peculiar views believed that God was everywhere." An expression not unlike that of a hunted deer shone for a moment in Abbie's eyes; then she spoke, in tones almost despairing: "Oh, mother, mother! You can not understand." Tone, or words, or both, vexed Mrs. Ried afresh, and she spoke with added sharpness: "At least I can understand this much, that my daughter is very anxious to do a thing utterly unheard of in its propriety, and I am thoroughly ashamed of you. If I were Ester I should not like to uphold you in such a singularly conspicuous parade. Remember, you have no one now but John to depend upon as an escort." Ralph had remained a silent, immovable listener to this strange, sad conversation up to this moment. Now he came suddenly forward with a quick, firm tread, and encircled Abbie's trembling form with his arm, while with eyes and voice he addressed his mother: "In that last proposition you are quite mistaken, my dear mother. Abbie chances to have a brother, who considers himself honored by being permitted to accompany her anywhere she may choose to go." Mrs. Ried looked up at her tall, haughty son in unfeigned astonishment, and for an instant was silent. "Oh," she said at last, "if you have chosen to rank yourself on this ridiculous, fanatical side, I have nothing more to say." As for Mr. Ried, he had long before this shaded his eyes with his hand, and was looking through half closed fingers with mournful eyes at the sable robes and pallid face of his golden haired darling, apparently utterly unconscious of, or indifferent to, the talk that was going on. But will Ralph ever forget the little sweet smile which illumined for a moment the pure young face as she turned confiding eyes on him? Thenceforth there dawned a new era in Abbie's life. Ralph, for reasons best known to himself, chose to be released from his vacation engagements in a neighboring city, and remained closely at home; and Abbie went as usual to her mission class, to her Bible class, to the teachers' prayer meeting, to the regular church prayer meeting, everywhere she had been wont to go, and was always and everywhere accompanied and sustained by her brother. As for Ester, these were days of great opportunity and spiritual growth to her. So we bridge the weeks between, and reach the afternoon of a September day, bright and beautiful, as the month draws toward its closing, and Ester is sitting alone in her room in the low, easy chair by the open window, and in her lap lies an open letter, while she, with thoughtful, earnest eyes, seems reading, not it, but the future, or else her own heart. The letter is from Sadie, and she has written thus: "My dear city sister, Mother said to night, as we were promenading the dining room for the sake of exercise, and also to clear off the table, Maggie had the toothache, and was off duty, 'Sadie, my dear child, haven't you written to Ester yet? Do you think it is quite right to neglect her so, when she must be very anxious to hear from home?' Now, you know, when mother says, 'Sadie, my dear child,' and looks at me from out those reproachful eyes of hers, there is nothing short of mixing a mess of bread that I would not do for her. So here I am, place third story front, time 11:30 P.M., position foot of the bed, Julia being soundly sleeping at the head. one gaiter off and one gaiter on, somewhat after the manner of "my son John," so renowned in history. Speaking of bread, how abominably that article can act! I had a solemn conflict with a batch of it this morning. Firstly, you must know I forgot it. Mother assured me it was ready to be mixed before I awakened, so it must have been before that event took place that the forgetfulness occurred. However, be that as it may, after I was thoroughly awake, and up and down, I still forgot it. The fried potatoes were frying themselves fast to that abominable black dish in which they are put to sizzle, and which, by the way, is the most nefarious article in the whole kitchen list to get clean, save and excepting the dishcloth. Well, as I was saying, they burned themselves, and I ran to the rescue. Then Minnie wanted me to go to the yard with her to see a "dear cunning little brown and gray thing, with some greenish spots, that walked and spoke to her." The interesting stranger proved to be a fair sized frog! While examining into and explaining minutely the nature and character and occupations of the entire frog family, the mixture in the tin pail, behind the kitchen stove, took that opportunity to sour. My, what a bubble it was in, and what an interesting odor it emitted, when at last I returned from frogdom to the ordinary walks of life, and gave it my attention. Maggie was above her elbows in the wash tub, so I seized the pail, and in dire haste and dismay ran up 2 flights of stairs in search of mother. I suppose you know what followed. I assure you, I think mothers and soda are splendid. What a remarkable institution that ingredient is! While I made sour into sweet with the aid of its soothing proclivities, I moralized; the result of which was that after I had squeezed and mushed and rolled over, and thumped and patted my dough the requisite number of times, I tucked it away under blankets in a corner, and went out to the piazza to ask Dr. Douglass if he knew of an article in the entire round of materia medica which could be given to human beings when they are sour and disagreeable, and which, after the manner of soda in dough, would immediately work a reform. On his acknowledging his utter ignorance of any such principle, I advanced the idea that cooking was a much more developed science than medicine. Thence followed an animated discussion. But in the meantime, what do you suppose that bread was doing? Just spreading itself in the most remarkable manner over the nice blanket under which I had cuddled it. Then I had an amazing time. Mother said the patting process must all be done over again, and there was abundant opportunity for more moralizing. That bread developed the most remarkable stick-to-itiveness that I ever beheld. I assure you, if total depravity is a mark of humanity, then I believe my dough is human. Well, we are all still alive, though poor Mr. Holland is, I fear, very little more than that. He was thrown from his carriage one evening last week, and brought home insensible. He is now in a raging fever, and very ill indeed. For once in our lives both doctors agree. He is delirious most of the time, and his delirium takes the very trying form which leads him to imagine that only mother can do anything for him. The doctors think he fancies she is his own mother, and that he is a boy again. All this makes matters rather hard on mother. She is frequently with him half the night, and often Maggie and I are left to reign supreme in the kitchen for the entire day. Those are the days that try men's souls, especially women's. I am sometimes tempted to think that all the book knowledge the world contains is not to be compared to knowing just what, and how, and when, to do in the kitchen. I quite think so for a few hours when mother, after a night of watching in a sick room, comes down to undo some of my blundering. She is the patientest, dearest, lovingest, kindest mother that ever a mortal had, and just because she is so patient, shall I rejoice over the day when she can give a little sigh of relief and leave the kitchen, calm in the assurance that it will be right side up when she returns. Ester, how did you make things go right? I'm sure I try harder than I ever knew you to, and yet salt will get into cakes and puddings, and sugar into potatoes. Just here I'm conscience smitten. I beg you will not construe one of the above sentences as having the remotest allusion to your being sadly missed at home. Mother said I was not even to hint such a thing, and I'm sure I haven't. I'm a remarkable housekeeper. The fall term at the Academy opened week before last. I have hidden my school books behind that old barrel in the northeast corner of the attic. I thought they would be safer there than below stairs. At least I was sure the bread would do better in the oven because of their ascent. To return to the scene of our present trials. Mr. Holland is, I suppose, very dangerously sick; and poor Mrs. Holland is the very embodiment of despair. When I look at her in prospective misery, I am reminded of poor dear Cousin Abbie, to whom I would write if it didn't seem a sacrilege, and I conclude that there is really more misery in this world of ours than I had any idea of. I've discovered why the world was made round. It must be to typify our lives, sort of a treadmill existence, you know; coming constantly around to the things which you thought you had done yesterday and put away, living over again today the sorrows which you thought were vanquished last week. I'm sleepy, and it is nearly time to bake cakes for breakfast. The tip of the morning to you, as Patrick O'Brien greets Maggie. Yours nonsensically, Sadie. End of chapter 19. Recording by Trisha G.